serve not just that county, as you could see from the numbers I just provided you, but with the surrounding counties, or they may be the only one in town. Businesses like that, the cuts to SNAP, it's pretty significant because that's sometimes the margin on which they're able to stay alive as a business. This would make it harder and more expensive for those grocery stores. It could put them out of business, that's for sure. That's what the grocery stores believe. But it also hurts the individual people in their areas because in the rural areas, you have an overwhelming number of seniors, you've got an overwhelming number of veterans, and you have just an overwhelming number of the people who are using these kinds of grocery stores. So SNAP supports hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in wages at these independent grocers, farms, other industries, including more than 1,700 jobs in Nebraska, more than 1,900 jobs in Kansas, more than 2,600 jobs in Iowa, more than 7,000 jobs in Missouri, more than 6,000 jobs in Wisconsin, more than 13,000 jobs in Michigan, more than 4,000 jobs in Minnesota. We know that from farmers and truckers to local grocers, for every dollar invested in SNAP, about $1.50 of economic activity is generated nationwide. For many Midwesterners, this bill would make the difference between having a grocery store in their region or not. I mentioned the shift of billions of dollars of cost to states that will blow holes through the state budget. They won't be able to afford it. And sadly, our Republican colleagues know this because 44 states have this balanced budget rule. And they're going to be forced to choose between paying the cost for food and paying for critical services. That is why 23 Democratic governors, all of them, just laid out in a letter to Congress. These cuts don't just increase state costs, they make it nearly impossible for states to effectively plan for these long-term budget impacts. Those are governors from Kentucky, with Governor Beshear, to Arizona, with Governor Hobbs. Across the entire nation, we heard from these governors. Not to mention the governors such as Governor Pritzker in Illinois and Governor Walz in Minnesota and Governor Kelly in Kansas and Governor Whitmer in Michigan. Based on 2023 figures, ready for this? The House and Senate version of this bill would shift, and it varies because the bills are different, but this is how much money we're talking to, between $16 million and $49 million onto the state of Nebraska, between $61 million and $101 million in costs onto Kansas. Imagine the budget. And there's suddenly, oh, you got to do an extra $60 million. Too bad you have a balanced budget amendment. Up to $26 million in costs onto Iowa, between $225 million and $376 million onto the state budget in Missouri, up to $68 million in costs onto Wisconsin, where Governor Evers was also a signator of this letter, between $456 and $761 million in costs onto Michigan, and between $43 million and $128 million in costs onto Minnesota. And those numbers are on top of an increased administrative cost shift to states. It used to be 50-50, now it's 75-25. Hello, states, you with strapped budgets, we're now making you pay 75% of administrative costs, which would make it even harder for states to invest in the staff training and upgraded financial systems that would make the program more sound and reduce payment errors. It's not just the state budgets that will be affected. In many states, including Minnesota and Wisconsin, it is counties rather than the states that run the SNAP program. So I had a visit from some of the rural counties, and they talk about living off a margin, a thin margin, trying to help their taxpayers, trying to get this done. In states like Minnesota and Wisconsin, that believe in strong local government, big surprise, our states and a number of other sort of states with bigger rural areas have decided we'd rather have the counties do this. So now these cost shifts will go directly to these county governments, and you would not believe the numbers on what they would have to do to increase their taxes in these rural counties. They said, we can't do that. So if that happens, they will have to raise their local property taxes or cut county services. In the past, we have said that if you're raising kids or taking care of an older relative, we're going to help you feed your family, even if you don't have a job. This reconciliation bill would change that. It would withhold food assistance from families raising kids over the age of 13 and adults 55 and up if they don't meet the new requirements. The Senate bill also eliminates an existing exemption for veterans, homeless people, and former foster youth, an exemption my Republican colleagues supported in the Fiscal Responsibility Act just 2 years ago. So this is a shift among the party. The Republican Party actually said this was a good idea to have exemptions for vets and homeless people and former foster youth. Not anymore. These are people who are already struggling, veterans who have sacrificed to serve our country. I believe that when our veterans signed up to serve, there wasn't a waiting line, and when they're in this country and they need help with food, or they need a job, or they need a home, there shouldn't be a waiting line in the United States of America. So everyone that I've talked to about this, just as Senator Tillis was saying about Medicaid in North Carolina, and I've spent time on this, I visit all 87 counties in my state every year. I'm up to 49. So I've been able to talk to people who aren't political, who are Republicans, talk to people I just run into in rural grocery stores, in the vegetable line. I mean, I have talked to a ton of people. And what they have said to the store managers, to the food shelf volunteers, to those that take SNAP, this isn't a good idea. That's what the public opinion polls say. Fox News poll, 60% of people say this bill is a bad idea. 2 to 1 say it's going to help wealthy people and not them. Well, they're right about that. This is a betrayal of the middle class, and it only takes 4 of our colleagues, and 4 in the House, by the way, to stand up and say, we need to rewrite this thing. Let's start over. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Nevada.
Mr. President, I rise today to express my strong opposition to the devastating and dangerous tax and spending bill that Senate Republicans are trying to jam through this weekend on a party line vote. A bill that will gut essential programs like Medicaid and SNAP just to pay for even more tax breaks for billionaires. So let's be clear about what's happening here. This big, beautiful betrayal, it isn't about fiscal discipline, it's fiscally reckless. It isn't about responsibility or doing what's best for average Americans. It's about misguided priorities. It's about giving more to the ultra-wealthy on the backs of hard-working families. This bill will take away health care and food assistance from people and families who need it most, just so D.C. Republicans can pay more for tax cuts for those who need them the least. D.C. Republicans want to have more tax cuts for those who need them the least. Once again, Republicans in Congress are putting the interests of the ultra-wealthy above the needs of hardworking families, children with disabilities, seniors, and Americans who rely on Medicaid each and every day. Earlier this year, I held a roundtable in Las Vegas with Nevada families who rely on Medicaid. For them, Medicaid is not just a talking point. They're not simply pay-fors in a budget bill. Medicaid is a lifeline. It literally keeps their children alive. I talked to people like Jessica, whose daughter Kay, well, she's 4 years old. She was born with Down syndrome and was recently diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Jessica relies on Medicaid to help cover the cost of weekly physical, speech, and occupational therapies for Kay, all of which are responsible, well, they're helping her learn to walk, to use utensils, to write her own name. Imagine when her mother sees her write her own name. It's a proud moment. Kay also has a cardiologist and an endocrinologist to manage conditions related to her Down syndrome. Medicaid covers these doctors. It covers her insulin. It covers the insulin pump that allows Jessica to manage her daughter's diabetes around the clock, well, because Kay can't communicate when her blood sugar is dangerously low or high. And Jessica said something at that round table I'll never forget. And I quote, "I can't imagine losing Medicaid. Obviously, I'm going to have to try to give up something because I'm not going to let her go without insulin and the life-saving care she needs. And I can't even imagine to think about what I'd have to cut or what I'd have to do in order to pay for the life-saving care that she needs and deserves." Christy, another Nevada mom, was also at that round table. Her daughter Sadie's 13. She's been bravely battling an aggressive form of leukemia for the past 2 years. Since her diagnosis, Sadie has spent more than a year and a half in and out of the hospital undergoing treatment for her cancer, all covered, thankfully, by Medicaid. Sadie's father, well, he passed away during the COVID pandemic, sadly. And Christy became Sadie's sole caregiver and sole provider. Medicaid, it's critical, and simply put, it is life-saving. So why are Republicans looking to cut it? So billionaires can get another tax break? So that Republican lawmakers can hand out trillions of dollars in tax giveaways to the wealthiest 1%, while thousands of people lose access to life-saving care? The cuts proposed to Medicaid, well, they're going to affect veterans and Nevadans with cancer who can't work and will be kicked off their health insurance, the insurance that they need to stay alive. It'll kick the family caregiver who takes care of both her aging parents, maybe off her own coverage. The majority of adults on Medicaid already work, and Republicans are counting on savings from these hardworking Americans losing coverage too because of paperwork. The paperwork is just going to be so bureaucratic, so full of red tape. The goal is to make it so hard, so damn burdensome that nobody can do it. No one can go to work, take care of their sick loved one, be sick themselves. They're hoping they drop off, even if they technically qualify. This is where they find their savings. Aren't we supposed to cut red tape and improve the lives of our constituents? And so this is just cruel. It's a lose-lose situation. People can't work because they have a life-threatening illness, or they're working and they miss the complicated new paperwork, where people are hoping that they can't do, so they'll drop off, and that's where they'll find the savings. They'll lose their health insurance, and maybe they'll drop off, and they'll lose their life too. All for a tax break for the wealthiest, for the billionaire cabinet of our current president. Mr. President, this is just shameful. This bill would also slash SNAP, as my colleagues before me have told you some of the statistics. SNAP, the nutrition program that helps nearly 1 in 6 Nevadans put food on the table. Most of these recipients are children. When they cut this program, you tell me what our family's supposed to do. You tell me what families are supposed to do when they cut food assistance. How are they going to put food on the table? What will they say to their hungry children? Sorry, kids, You have to go hungry so billionaires can get a tax break? This just can't be right. This just can't be right. And it doesn't stop there. This bill threatens thousands of good-paying union jobs in Nevada across our country by letting critical tax credits for solar, for wind projects expire before those projects can even get off the ground. You know, in Nevada, we have more solar jobs per capita, more than any other state in the nation. And we have enough solar energy to power nearly 1.3 million homes. It's a growing, terrific industry in Nevada. We need all the energy we can get at an affordable price. And this bill is going to decimate this important and growing industry, not just in my state, but in states across this country. And on top of that, Republicans have added an additional new tax on wind and solar projects. It just won't kill the industry. Like I said, it's going to raise prices on hard-working families who are already paying too much for their energy. I thought we're supposed to be lowering prices, creating opportunities, expanding, and investing in our infrastructure and in our nation. But this bill is going to add more taxes, slash products, and raise energy prices for hardworking families. And all of this is causing companies across the country to stall or cancel projects over the uncertainty of losing access to the tax credits. This means fewer jobs, less investment, and just more families wondering actually how they're going to make ends meet. And we're talking about an industry that supports nearly 280,000 American workers, electricians, technicians, construction crews. I could go on and on about all the jobs that are in our solar and wind industry. And we're pulling the rug right out from under them, and killing thousands, hundreds of thousands of clean energy jobs. Again, I'm going to remind you, all of this for one purpose and one purpose alone, to give tax breaks to billionaires. So anyone who supports this bill is not pro-worker. They're not looking out for underdogs, for hardworking families. They're just focused on making the rich, well, richer. And I'm not going to stand by and let families lose access to their health care, to their food assistance, to their jobs. Also, billionaires can pad their pockets. And I want to remind people what we did when we used the reconciliation process. We expanded health insurance subsidies, and for the first time, we gave Medicare the authority to negotiate for lower drug prices for our seniors. We invested in our clean energy future. We cut costs for families instead of cutting lifelines. And this D.C. Republican bill is extreme. It's cruel, and it's not what the American people want. People want lower costs. People want economic security. Parents want their kids to have care when they're sick and a fair shot to thrive. They don't want their future sold off to billionaires. So I say to my Republican colleagues, please don't turn your backs. Please don't turn your backs on families who need you, who need this the most. I want you to come look at my Nevada moms and my Nevada dads in the eyes and tell them they don't matter, that their children don't matter, that their lives of their kids don't matter because they won't get the care they need. And I shudder to think of the consequences. Please come to Nevada, sit with these parents and tell them that they don't matter. I don't know how you could face them and gut Medicaid to give billionaires a tax cut, but that's what you're about to do. And the American people deserve better. And I will fight every single step of the way to make sure that they get it. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
The senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to be brief. I promise Senator Hollins, I'm sorry, Senator. Going to be about 5 minutes. This is an easy one. Number one, I should have probably said this earlier. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I completely disagree with the narrative of the billionaire taxes. Folks, this is actually reducing or making sure that we don't raise taxes on people like me that grew up in trailer parks, didn't get my degree till I was 37, struggled to make ends meet. Those people benefit from that. I've read the bill. I think most of you know I'm detail-oriented. It's not what it seems. So I also should thank Senator Crapo. He's a good friend, great leader. I should have thanked him for the hard work that he's doing. I got a little bit focused on the Medicaid failed baseline that's in the bill, but I should have started with that. So thanks to Mike Crapo and to Senator Thune, who I admire as our leader. Mr. President, I'm here to talk about the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, though. It's another classic example where think tanks and people that haven't worked a day in business are setting policy in the White House without a clue about what they're potentially doing to our grid. A lot of people probably, I had Alex Weinstein, who is a self-described philosopher and expert in this area in my office, talking with 3 people, practitioners that actually work in it. One of them is someone who specializes in power purchase agreements for large businesses. Walmart's one of the most sophisticated buyers of electrons in the world. They map out their power requirements years in advance. They want to make sure that their food doesn't spoil and they got power running. They've already made several power purchase agreements with projects underway, folks. And this bill is basically gutting it. Instead, and everybody's high-fiving. What's amazing to me, Mr. President, is the mark that we laid down the other day almost achieved the same level of cuts of the House bill within $30 billion. Within $30 billion. And instead of thinking that was progress, somebody got cute and decided to take away in construction and put it in service. Let me tell you why that's disingenuous. I was a partner at Price Waterhouse, worked in the utilities practice, large utilities like TECO, Duke, Florida Progress, AEP. I know this industry. I understand base load. I understand peaking, and I understand this technology, which is increasingly becoming viable because of storage as a part of augmenting base load. Well, now we've got the Walmarts and all of these data centers and everything that we want to bring back on shore, putting in these power purchase agreements teed to these projects like solar in particular, like wind and other innovative, renewable natural gas, methane, hydrogen. I can go on. But somebody, a self-described philosopher in a think tank that I admire a lot, but I realize if you're a philosopher and you're in a think tank, you by definition have never worked in an operational role. So you can't possibly understand what happens to this pipeline of power purchase agreements and the future of our grid. So here's what's going to happen. Wipe it clean. Put an excise tax in. Effectively throw the football in the end zone, spin it, and walk away and do the party dance. And what you have done is create a blip in power service because there isn't going to be a gas-fired generator anytime soon. Folks, the generators necessary to create power with gas, best case 5 years from now. That's best case. 5 years from now. So you can't get that online at the same time this whole pipeline is going down. So I want that philosopher to tell me that he understands how to plan out power over time and to let me know that when all these projects fail, some will make it, some will get subsidized, some will go bankrupt, so it won't be Armageddon, but it's going to be a problem. So they better get it right. It's another example, folks, when you rush a bill and you don't think through the implementation, you don't get it right. And so I hope that my colleagues recognize it's half-baked. It's another reason why we should go back to the House, Mark, get Medicaid right so I can come on the floor and tell my colleagues on the other side of the aisle why they're wrong on all the attributes of the House, Mark, why they are wrong on some of their characterizations of the tax bill, and why they will be wrong on an energy policy that makes sense. But I have to vote against a bill from my own party that I have never parted from before because we're rushing to an arbitrary deadline with people who have never worked a day in this industry, maybe philosophized and written a few white papers on it, but haven't gotten their hands dirty. I have, and this is another segment of the bill that needs to change. Thank you, Mr. President.
President.
The senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, Donald Trump likes to call the bill that Republicans are trying to rush through this Senate the big, beautiful bill. Well, it's big, all right. It took the Senate clerk nearly 16 hours to speed read through it. But it is only beautiful if you're a billionaire or otherwise very wealthy in America. For everybody else, this is a big, ugly betrayal of a bill. Betrayal because tax cuts for billionaires are coming at the expense of virtually everyone else. Now, I agree with many of the things my colleague from North Carolina, Senator Tillis, just said. But I've also read the bill. And if you look at the bill, the tax benefits overwhelmingly go to the very highest income earners in the United States of America. 50% of those tax benefits go to just the top 5%. So this is a choice that is being made by Donald Trump and Republicans in Congress to give to billionaires additional tax handouts at the expense of the rest of the country. They are choosing to engage in a huge transfer of wealth from people who are working paycheck to paycheck to those who are living off their huge inheritances or gigantic stock portfolios. Now, Mr. President, Americans are going to have to pay for the tax cuts for billionaires in many, many ways. Millions will lose access to health care. Others will no longer be able to put food on the table. Others will not be able to afford to pay heating bills on freezing nights. Virtually every American will see their energy bills increase and their health insurance premiums go up. And every American is likely to face higher borrowing costs for their home mortgages or car loans. Again, also billionaires and very wealthy people can get big tax cuts. Let's look at some of the real hits to American families, starting with the attack on health care. Donald Trump said he would, quote, love and cherish Medicaid. He said the people won't be affected. That's a lie. What he loves are tax cuts for his billionaire buddies. So let's just take a look. This bill pays for over $1 trillion in tax giveaways to people who make over $500,000 every year by cutting $1 trillion of health benefits from those who rely on Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. Think about that trade-off. Indeed, because of the cuts to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act in this bill, 12 million Americans will lose access to health care coverage. On top of that, another 5 million Americans will lose access to health coverage because Republicans refuse to extend the tax credits that millions of middle-class Americans use to purchase coverage through the Affordable Care Act. So while extending tax cuts for the very wealthy, they are not extending the health care tax credits that middle-class Americans use to help afford health insurance. The result of these cuts and the refusal to extend those tax credits means that nearly 17 million of our fellow Americans will lose access to health care coverage. In my state of Maryland, that's 229,000 of my fellow Marylanders. And who are these Americans? Who are these Marylanders? They're babies and children. Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program covers 38 million children in America, 700,000 children in Maryland. Medicaid covers 40% of births in America, over 40% of births in Maryland. More mothers will die during pregnancy-related deaths as a result of pregnancy-related deaths if this bill passes. I think we also know that Medicaid is especially important to helping people through the vulnerable stages of their lives. It covers 1 in 4 people with mental health or substance use disorders. It's the primary payer for long-term health services, covering 60% of nursing home residents. If even a fraction of those residents lose coverage, entire nursing homes can close. And those families will have to figure out how to care for their expelled loved ones. An analysis that was done estimates that as many as 500 healthcare or nursing homes could close because they're on the cusp. Rural hospitals are also especially vulnerable, and it's estimated that up to 300 rural hospitals could close if this bill passes. Americans with disabilities, Medicaid is absolutely essential to their lives. It helps them receive home and community-based care so they don't have to choose between getting the care they need and being separated from their loved ones. A study by Yale University and the University of Pennsylvania predicts that this bill, before the Senate, will result in over 51,000 preventable deaths each year. Preventable deaths. So officially, the death certificates will say that somebody passed away because they had late-stage cancer. It was detected too late, because they couldn't get the preventative care they needed. Or an accident occurred at a nursing home because there were not enough nurses on site. But those reasons, those conditions will have been set because this bill passed. And again, making millions of Americans more vulnerable to pay for tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy is unconscionable, but it is the choice being made in this bill. Now, 17 million people who will lose their health coverage is a very big number to wrap our heads around. So I want to read just a few stories of Marylanders who rely on Medicaid and who have been watching closely this whole effort that has unfolded on the floor of the United States Senate. I had a call from one of my constituents who has a son. Her son takes chemotherapy, and it relies on those chemotherapy treatments to sustain his life. She wrote to me that if he loses access to his health insurance, that it would be, quote, a death sentence. Another Marylander wrote to me about his autistic son, who is still able to work, but who depends entirely on Medicaid for support. He also said, please don't let the Senate pass this bill. And the stories go on and on and on. Just the other day, Senator Alsobrooks and I had a telephone town hall, had 12,000 Marylanders joining us. And after that call, we received many more stories about people who would really be in desperate shape if they lost access to their health coverage. Now, Mr. President, on top of the 17 million Americans who stand to lose their health coverage, all other Americans are likely to see higher premiums, because what happens when you have uncompensated care is more people go to the emergency rooms at the hospital, and those hospitals can't just eat all those additional costs. And at the end of the day, those additional costs cycle through the system in the form of higher premiums for others. And we are already seeing that impact in Maryland as insurance companies today look at the possible liability that they will have going forward as a result of this legislation. Now, beyond the 17 million who will lose access to affordable health care, you also have millions of Americans who are going to be hit as a result of the cuts to the food and nutrition programs, the SNAP programs. We're going to see a whopping 20% cut, $200 billion, to the SNAP program. Over 40 million Americans get some kind of help from that food and nutrition program, and over 3 million of them will lose their SNAP benefits entirely. Others will see rising costs. In Maryland, it's going to impact 684,000 people, most of whom are families with kids. Now, Mr. President, in addition to 17 million Americans losing access to health care coverage, in addition to the 40 million Americans who will be impacted by cuts to food and nutrition programs, I want to just focus for a moment on another hit to American households. Some of us have discussed it on this Senate floor before, but it hasn't gotten as much attention. And it relates to the energy bills Americans pay, including their electric bills, because this bill will drive them up because it directly attacks the production of more clean energy. And less energy with rising demand means higher costs for households. I don't know if folks remember about a year ago when Donald Trump had a steak dinner at Mar-a-Lago, where he begged 20 fossil fuel CEOs for campaign cash. It was reported on at the time. Well, he succeeded in raking in hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign donations, and now we see the payoff in this bill to those powerful special interests. And that payoff comes in two forms. First, this bill gives big oil companies a new $1 billion tax break. As a result, some of the fossil fuel companies will pay $0 in federal income tax. Second, this bill, and the senator from North Carolina referred to some of the provisions that will have this impact, this bill sabotages the production of more clean energy. It does so by slashing production and investment tax credits for clean energy and scuttling new clean energy projects. And it continues the Trump administration's baseless attacks on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, a program we established that will be a win-win-win for our environment, for our economy, and for family pocketbooks. By cutting these clean energy incentives and initiatives, this bill will reduce the overall amount of energy added to our electric grids by at least 50% by 2035. Think about that. So this bill is going to result in a dramatic reduction in the amount of new energy produced that goes on the electric grids, and with less energy generated and higher demand, household energy costs and bills are going to go up. In fact, it's predicted that household electricity bills will go up by $110 on average as soon as next year, and by up to $400 per year for families over the next decade. This will serve the interests of big oil and gas producers and utility companies who benefit from the higher prices that consumers will have to shell out. This will also do something else, Mr. President. It will surrender entirely the clean energy playing field to China, who already has a big head start on us in the area of clean energy deployment. So this is not America first. This is very much America in retreat. I don't often agree with Elon Musk, but he is absolutely right when he said just a few days ago that, and I quote, "The latest Senate draft bill will destroy millions of jobs in America and cause immense strategic harm to our country. Utterly insane and destructive. It gives handouts to industries of the past while severely damaging industries of the future." That's the Republican Senate bill, looking in the rearview mirror rather than ahead. And again, what is the driving purpose? What's the North Star of this bill? To give very, very wealthy people tax cuts at the expense of everybody else. Everything else is sacrificed. As a result of those tax cuts, the top 0.1% highest income earners will get an average tax break of $255,000. Top 0.1%, tax break of $255,000. Individuals making over $1 million a year will get a $35,000 tax break. And as I said earlier, almost 50% of all of the tax benefits, all the tax monies go to the top 5% of income earners. And to make that happen, as I've said, everything else gets sacrificed. Cuts to Medicaid, cuts to food and nutrition programs, cuts to clean energy that result in higher costs for consumers. But even after making all of those cuts and imposing all of that pain on so many Americans, this Republican bill is still going to add over $4 trillion to our deficit over the next 10 years, and an estimated $35 trillion over the next 30 years. So despite paying for part of those additional costs through cuts to Medicaid and food nutrition programs, they're going to blow the roof off of our deficits and debt. And make no mistake, when you do that, you cost every American, because it will generate upward pressure on interest rates, which raises costs for Americans who want to take out a mortgage to buy a home, or want to get a car loan, or for small businesses. In fact, the Yale Budget Lab projects that the House-passed bill would add over $1,000 a year to the cost of a mortgage, and over $800 a year to the cost of a small business loan. That's the House-passed bill. The Senate bill will be worse, because the Senate bill is about $1 trillion more to the deficit over 10 years than the House bill. Now, Mr. President, I do want to just focus on a final aspect of the deficit and debt impact of the Senate Republican bill. And that is this very deliberate effort to use fraudulent accounting to hide the deficit impact of this bill from the American people. Let me give you an example. Let's say you signed a contract to rent an apartment for $2,000 a month. You know that's going to cost you $24,000 for the full year. Now, at the end of the year, if you want to keep renting that apartment at that rate, any normal person would say, well, that's going to cost them another $24,000. Senate Republicans want to tell the American people that the cost of continuing to rent that apartment for another year is zero, because the amount of rent they have to pay in year 2 is the same rent they had to pay in year 1. In other words, Republicans want to say that because they've been giving billionaires and wealthy people tax cuts for 10 years, it will cost nothing to extend them for another 10 years. That's the so-called, quote, current policy baseline. In other words, if you just keep in place for another 10 years the same tax breaks for billionaires and others, we don't have to count the lost revenue. And we don't have to count the amount the deficit will increase as a result of that lost revenue. Now, Mr. President, a third grader can see that this is bogus math. Let me read my colleagues a statement made this year by somebody, and I quote, anyone who says that about the, here's what he said, anybody that says the current policy baseline is the way to go is engaging in intellectual and economic fraud, end of quote. I wanted to make sure I got that quote correct because it was made by a Republican congressman from Arizona, Congressman Schweihart. Here's another quote. This is fairy dust, and they are all full of crap, and I'm going to call them out on it. Who said that? Congressman Chip Roy, Republican from Texas. And I think it's worth quoting those Republican members of Congress because while I dramatically disagree with what they did in their House bill, at least they used honest accounting. At least they didn't try to perpetrate this budget fraud that we're witnessing here in the United States Senate. A budget fraud that would, I dare say, make the Enron scammers blush. And if you go through the numbers, it's dramatic. For example, honest scoring of the bill shows that extending the individual tax rates from Trump 2017 will cost $2.2 trillion. That's what the House of Representatives said, $2.2 trillion. When you use the fraudulent budget math that Senate Republicans want to use, all of a sudden that's $83 billion. If you look at the cost of extending key deductions for businesses, the House used accurate accounting. It comes to $820 billion over 10 years. Under the Senate plan, $6 billion. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time, Mr. President, going over this chart, but I do want to put it up here. This is from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And the blue shade in each of these years shows what Senate Republicans say their bill will cost in each of those years. This is the so-called current policy baseline. This is what those House Republican members called fraudulent accounting, and it is. And if you add up all of those blue deficits over those 10 years, they claim it's $441 billion additional debt over 10 years. But if you use the honest accounting that we've always used in the United States Senate for the purpose of budget reconciliation, you get the full bar, including the orange numbers, which is $4.2 trillion in debt over those 10 years. I do want to point out to my colleagues something interesting because you have these dashed orange lines. What this is representing is that some of these costs from lost revenues in some of these out years go down. That's because under this House Republican plan, the tax cuts for people with the no tax on tips, they go away. They vanish. They vanish right here in 2029. But the tax cuts for very wealthy people, for billionaires and others, they go on for the 10 years. In fact, they go on forever. And the last point I'm going to make is by letting them go on forever, tax cuts for very wealthy people, Senate Republicans are violating the entire structure of the budget reconciliation process. Because when it was first devised, the entire purpose of it was to reduce our deficits and reduce the debt. And Republican senators are perverting the entire purpose of that special procedure that allows things to pass in the United States Senate with 51 votes and not having to secure the 60-vote threshold to overcome a filibuster. They are violating that entire structure. And again, why? Because they're hell-bent on making sure those tax cuts for very wealthy people go on forever. And again, at the expense of everybody else. And I'll just close, Mr. President, by pointing out that it wasn't that long ago that just down this hall here in the Senate Rotunda, Donald Trump took the oath of office. He looked at the cameras and he said he wanted a new golden age for America. But this is not a golden age for America. It is a gilded age for the wealthiest people in America. And those are the people he was really speaking to because they're the ones who are sitting right behind him on Inauguration Day. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, the tech titans, the billionaire cabinet, more billionaires than any cabinet by far in American history. That's who this bill serves. It serves very wealthy and powerful people, and it does so at the expense of everybody else in America in one form or another. And I hope our Senate, on a bipartisan basis, will give it a big thumbs down, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
To recognize the senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, never in my time in Congress have I seen a bill that does so much damage in so many ways to so many people in so many states and that will affect so many generations. Mr. President, the clerks have read the bill. It's now time for us to kill the bill. The point of reading the bill was to reveal that this bill has one goal, and that is to extend tax cuts to very wealthy Americans, where the top 1% will get 60% of the benefit, and to make everyday Americans pay the price to fund those tax cuts. And it's no wonder right now that 2 in 3 Americans oppose this bill. The question is, will the United States Senate oppose this bill? Here are just a few ways that the president's so-called one big, beautiful bill will hurt Vermont. In Vermont, 11,500 people will lose their health care coverage under Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. 21,000 Vermonters will lose Medicaid coverage. And food nutrition programs that are so essential to the well-being of your citizens and mine. In Vermont, the SNAP program, 11% of our households use it, 65,000 people. A little over a third of households rely on the SNAP program, and they have kids. Nearly 3,000 veterans in Vermont rely on the SNAP program. By the way, we're talking about $6 a day. Billions are going to be cut across the country, and that's going to hurt Vermont, and it's going to hurt everyone. In Vermont, some homeowners, to save money on their energy bills, use the home energy efficiency upgrades that was made possible under the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are being ripped apart. Folks saved about $420 to $980 a year. That's real money for people living paycheck to paycheck. This bill scraps that. Mr. President, here's the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good, we still have time to kill this bill. And we should kill this bill. We Democrats are united in opposition to this bill, but it's not only Democrats whose constituents are going to be hurt by this bill. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have an opportunity to make a choice. Read the bill and decide, are you going to protect your constituents who are going to suffer the same afflictions as my constituents, or are you going to defer to President Trump? The bad in this bill, it's going to inflict bipartisan pain. This is not aiming at red state or blue state. This is aimed at working class and middle class Americans. More than 76,000, just to give an example, West Virginia, a great state I visited, went into a coal mine, hardest working people ever, except maybe for Vermont dairy farmers. More than 76,000 people in West Virginia will lose access to health care because of this bill. 278,000 West Virginians are going to lose access to the nutrition programs of SNAP. In Tennessee, more than 295,000 people will lose access to health care, Medicaid, through this bill. And SNAP means 758,000 Tennesseans lose their nutrition benefits. So I just want to repeat here, this is the bipartisan infliction of pain. This is real. This is real. And is the tax cut largely directed to the very wealthy people? Is it worth inflicting that kind of pain on so many when the tax cut benefits so few? Mr. President, let's talk more about what's in this bill, because the American people, they need to know what we're voting on. It makes major cuts, of course, as I've said, in Medicaid. But the immediate effect of those Medicaid cuts is that it really threatens the financial stability, the viability of the community hospitals that are in all of our communities. Folks are going to show up to get care. And across the country, 17 million people will lose any reimbursement from Medicaid. So they'll go to our community hospitals and they'll do what they do. They'll provide care even if they don't get paid, but they can only do that so long. So those hospitals are literally threatened to go out of business in every single state. This bill cuts Medicaid by over $930 billion. So that ripple effect is going to hurt all of our hospitals. And absolutely some of those are going to close. And by the way, that's going to result in a higher cost shift, so that those employers who are doing everything they can to provide employer-sponsored health care for their employees are going to see their premiums spike badly. The bill's going to rip away food assistance programs that more than 42 million Americans need. That's $6 a day, as I mentioned, and that'll be gone. This, by the way, has a real impact on our farmers. They put food on our table. One of the things that our farmers are so proud of is they feed America and they feed the world. And they've been able to supply the food that is then distributed through the SNAP program. It's going to undercut the revenue that they get for doing really good for a lot of people across our country. The bill takes us backwards in our effort to expand energy production and fight climate change. The bill actually adds a tax on wind and solar. It takes away the incentives and it adds a tax. And Mr. President, 95% of the new electric generation, and we need so much more of it, in the past few years has come from clean energy. We don't have that going into production to provide energy along with storage technology. The cost of electricity to the people you represent and the folks I represent in Vermont is going up. Mr. President, there's another aspect of this bill. It just makes no sense being in this bill. It makes no sense being in any bill, particularly. It is a Republican-led bill that strips states of their right to pass laws to protect their consumers against AI threats and against social media threats. It imposes a moratorium for 10 years on any states taking any action. This affects Vermont directly. It affects every single one of our states. And how, I ask, can one argue they're for state rights and then strip states of being able to act on behalf of their own citizens? This bill is a real threat to our economy. It's going to increase the debt, already about $35 trillion, by at least $3.3 trillion. And for what? Tax cuts to very, very wealthy people, multinational corporations who are having record profits at the expense of health care, at the expense of our community hospitals, at the expense of our investments in clean energy, at the expense of our food and nutrition programs. Invested in what? It's destructive. It's not productive. Inflation is going up under this bill. Just think of how much more we're going to pay in debt service. Dead money. It's about $1 trillion. So home mortgages, folks are going to be paying at least $1,000 more. Small business loans, at least $1,000 more. Grocery prices, definitely going up for about all Americans. You know, Mr. President, there's an ugly aspect of this bill as well. And it is that this bill is entirely in service of providing tax cuts largely to the very wealthy. The top 1% of income earners in this country will get 60% of the benefit. That's a couple of 100,000 people will get immense tax breaks that exceed the so-called tax breaks that go to a couple of 100 million Americans. And it's those in the 60% category that are going to be paying the higher prices for utilities, credit card debt, cost of a car loan, rent, groceries. So, Mr. President, I say let's come to our senses and not do something that is in a massive escalation of the wealth transfer from the working class, the middle class, to the very, very wealthy. Many of us have a number of amendments, and I do too, to try to make the point that our job is to make things better for everyday working Americans, not inflict additional burdens on them. We have a job to do, and it's to strengthen this economy, provide more stability for our families and our communities. And in this bill, we're doing exactly the opposite, aggravating income inequality, not mitigating it, accelerating climate change rather than diminishing it, making life tougher for everyday families. Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to defeat this bill, and I yield back.
Mr. President.
To recognize the senator from Maine.
Mr. President, this bill is a farce. Imagine a bunch of guys sitting around a table and saying, I've got a great idea. Let's give $32,000 worth of a tax break to a millionaire, and we'll pay for it by taking health insurance away from lower income and middle income people. And to top it off, how about we cut food stamps, we cut SNAP, we cut food aid to people. It's a joke. I would say it was a joke, except it's not the least bit funny. I've been in this business of public policy now for 20 years, 8 years as governor, 12 years in the United States Senate. I have never seen a bill this bad. I have never seen a bill that is this irresponsible, regressive, and downright cruel. The basic premise of the bill, as I said, is cut benefits for the American people, particularly in the areas of health care and food, in exchange for tax cuts for the very wealthy. Now, I know my colleagues are going to come to the floor because I've had this discussion before. They're going to say, oh no, this is a middle-class tax cut. This is going to cut taxes for people in the middle class. Well, here's a little suggestion of how to get out of this mess. If you cap the tax cuts at people making $400,000 a year, which is a pretty healthy income, the cost of this bill would drop by 60%. And you wouldn't have any need to cut Medicaid. And by the way, there are Medicare cuts also built into this, and SNAP. $400,000. In other words, we're for the middle class tax cuts. That's okay. But just stop it at $400,000 and don't give the tax breaks to the people. A millionaire under this bill gets a $32,000 tax cut. A person making $5 or $10 million gets a couple of $100,000 tax cut. I don't think they need it. They sure as hell don't need it as much as people need health insurance. So just to put a fine point on it, this bill is literally, and remember my $400,000 suggestion, so we're taking care of the middle class, but with 60% of the cost above $400,000 in income, this bill is literally taking food out of the mouths of kids to give a millionaire a $32,000 tax break. That's the facts. They're ugly. And like I say, if we were talking about this in random, sitting around at a lunch table, people would say, well, that's a joke, that's ridiculous. Nobody would suggest that. But here we are. And several of my colleagues, including Senator Tillis from North Carolina, have pointed out there's no rush on this bill. We don't have to do this bill by July 4th or July 10th. There's no rush. These tax credits, these tax cuts don't expire until the end of the year. Let's take our time and write a decent bill. Let's kill this bill. It'll only take 4 or 5 senators on the other side. We can kill this thing and start over and write a decent bill on a bipartisan basis. And I think we'd find agreement on middle-class tax cuts. But I think we could also do some things with expenditures that wouldn't be so bloody harmful. Medicaid. Let me start with hospitals. In Maine, I've talked to the hospitals, I've talked to the Hospital Association, I've talked to small hospitals, large hospitals. They're mostly running on a 1%, 2%, or 3% margin. The analysis is that this could cost us 2 to 5 of our rural hospitals. And when a rural hospital goes out, several things happen. One thing is the economy of the town goes with it. In most of these small towns, the hospital is the major employer. So you're talking about the economics of those jobs in a small town that will make a huge difference in that local economy. The second thing that happens is a loss of services for everybody in town, not just the Medicaid people. That hospital closes, everybody in town is going to have to drive another 30, 40, 50, 100 miles to get care. And they're going to have to not only, there may be closures, there will certainly be cutting of services. We already have a serious problem in Maine of obstetric services. We've got a county with no obstetric services. And that's only going to get worse under this bill. The hospitals are pleading with us to not do this. And again, do we really need to do this to give a millionaire a $32,000 tax break? It doesn't make any sense. Now, I've talked about hospitals, but let's talk about people. The analysis is 60,000 people in Maine would lose their insurance coverage. 40,000 under Medicaid, about 20,000 under the Affordable Care Act. And we've had a lot of personal stories tonight. I want to tell a story about myself. When I worked here in the 70s, I had insurance. It was employer-supported insurance. We paid part of the premium. I had insurance as a junior staff member in this body 50 years ago. Because I had that insurance that covered a free checkup, I went in and had my first physical in 8 years. And I wouldn't have had that physical if the insurance hadn't have covered it. I wouldn't have been able to spring for it. I had that physical, and the doctors found a little mole on my back, and they took it out. And I didn't think much of it, and I went in a week later, and the doctor said, "You better sit down, Angus. That was malignant melanoma. You're going to have serious surgery." And a friend of mine who was a doctor said, "Angus, here's my best advice. Let them be as radical as they want in that surgery." And I had the surgery, and here I am. If I hadn't had insurance, I wouldn't be here. And it's always haunted me that some young man in America that same year had malignant melanoma. He didn't have coverage, he didn't have insurance, he didn't get that checkup, and he died. That's wrong, that's immoral. So the idea of cutting health insurance from people is just, oh, well, they just won't have coverage for their doctor's visits. No, people die when they don't have health insurance. There is statistical analysis to bear that out. So this isn't any joke. And by the way, people say, well, we're talking about fraud in Medicaid. Listen, almost $1 trillion cut in Medicaid, 15 million people being cut off, 60,000, 40,000 in the state of Maine, that isn't fraud. That's cutting people who need the care. And I don't understand the obsession, and I never have, and I stood right there and watched John McCain cast that vote to save the Affordable Care Act, along with my colleague Susan Collins. I don't understand this obsession with taking health insurance away from people. I don't get it. Trying to take away the Affordable Care Act in 2017 or 2018, and now this? What's driving this? What's the cruelty to do this, to take health insurance away from people, knowing that it's going to cost them? It's hard to calculate the cost, up to and including losing their lives. Okay, let's talk about SNAP. Let's talk about SNAP. The average benefit for SNAP is $6 a day. You feed yourself on $6 a day. The average cost of a meal in the U.S. is about $10.50 a day. So we're already below cost, if you will. And here's what it means in my state. 20% of the children in my state are food insecure. And we're talking about cutting SNAP and taking dollars away from those kids. And I was interested in that, and I thought, oh, that's pretty bad. I'm worried Maine's 20%. 20% of our kids are food insecure. So I did a little research. In Arkansas, it's 24% of the kids who are food insecure. In Iowa, 17%. South Carolina, 14%. Michigan, 19%. Missouri, another 19%. That's 1 out of 5 kids are food insecure, and we're going to cut that food in order to give a millionaire a $32,000 tax cut. Mr. President, that's not only bad policy, it's downright immoral. Okay, what's the other problem with this bill? There's so many, and so many problems, so little time. It's irresponsible. It adds about $4 trillion to the deficit. And by the way, this current policy thing doesn't pass a straight face test. A 7th grader knows the budget. If it passes, there is. And the thing that really gives a lie to this nonsense is also in this bill is a $5 trillion increase in the debt ceiling. If it's not really debt, then we don't need to increase the debt ceiling. It's a sham. Voodoo budgeting. So, I don't want to hear any more from my colleagues about deficits. I don't want to hear any more crocodile tears about deficits. Necessarily, there's a saying of a famous New Englander, your actions speak so loud I can't hear your words. Your actions speak so loud I can't hear your words. Your actions are, you're adding to the deficit unnecessarily. So don't talk to me about deficits. Now, the first rule, if you're in a hole, is stop digging. And we're in a hole, Mr. President. We're in a hole, so you stop digging by not passing this bill or not passing it in the extreme form that it is to give the tax benefits, 60% of the tax benefits to people making over $400,000 a year. The reason, what's driven the deficit, if you go back and look over the last 20 years, there are 3 things. One were the unpaid for Bush tax cuts. We had major tax cuts and then a war that we put on the credit card. The unpaid for Trump tax cuts in 2017, and COVID. Now, COVID was an emergency, and the financial crisis in 2008 and 9 and 10, that were emergencies. That's where you run deficits. But you don't run deficits when times are good, and that's exactly what we're doing here. If you're in a hole, stop digging. And by the way, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a nonpartisan group, has said, and I haven't heard this mentioned, this bill will actually accelerate the insolvency of the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund. There's a nice thing for you. It'll make those funds go insolvent sooner than would otherwise be the case. Gutting the IRS. By the way, I have another suggestion for my colleagues. You want to find $600 billion a year? Enforce the tax laws against cheaters. That's the estimate. $600 billion a year is left on the table because cheaters, mostly high income, are not paying the taxes they owe. The poor stiff that gets a 1040, he has to pay it. Everybody knows what he's making. But it's these people with the fancy lawyers and accountants, and I'm not talking about tax avoidance here. I'm talking about stone-cold tax evasion. $600 billion a year. That would be nice instead of cutting Medicare and Medicaid and
food stamps. Another piece of this bill that hasn't got much attention is ICE. The current budget of ICE is $9 billion a year. Under this, they're increasing it $75 billion over 4 years. That's an additional $18 billion a year. They're tripling the budget of ICE. They're tripling the budget. We're dangerously close, Mr. President, to creating a federal police force, which we've never had in this country and we shouldn't have. And by the way, I have never in my life seen a law enforcement officer with a mask on. I don't get where that came from. A law enforcement officer wearing a mask. Where I come from, people that wear masks are not the good guys. And I don't understand that, but to triple this budget, you wonder where that's going to take this country. So let me go back to the beginning. All this damage to give a tax break to a guy who's making $1 million. The chairman of the Finance Committee wasn't here, I think, when I said this. Mr. Chairman, if we limit the tax cuts to people making $400,000 and less, it will reduce the cost of this bill by 60%. It will ameliorate the need for any cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. It would also minimize the hit on the debt and the deficit. There is no rush to pass this bill. Let's kill it, give it a merciful death over the next 24 hours, and then start over writing a responsible bill to deal with the expiring tax cuts for the middle class and deal with issues within the federal government that should be addressed. But this bill is not the answer. It is a sham, and it is a shame, and it is embarrassing to even be debating this bill. It should have never come before us in this form. I hope that enough of my colleagues will see that this is an unnecessary damage to the citizens of this country and the citizens of their state. Every state's citizens are going to suffer. And this is something that we in this body can and should prevent. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate complete its business today, it stand adjourned until 9 a.m. until Monday, June 30th, that following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate resume consideration of calendar number 107, H.R. 1. Further, that the leaders be recognized, and following their remarks, all debate time on calendar number 107, H.R. 1, be expired.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of my colleagues, pursuant to the relevant debate time limits under the Congressional Budget Act.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, what are we doing here? Seriously. I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me how this makes sense. We are debating a budget that gives another round of tax cuts to billionaires and giant corporations on the backs of everyday Americans. And it also adds trillions of dollars to our national debt. That doesn't make any sense to me. And it doesn't make sense to the Arizonans that I've been hearing from in every corner of our state. If you grew up in a household like mine, where money was tight, you would know that budgets are about priorities. I can still picture my mom sitting at the kitchen table trying to figure out which bills to pay. You take the money you have and you put it where it's needed. This budget clearly tells the American people who President Trump and Republicans in Washington need help. If you're a billionaire, it says, we've got your back. But if you're a parent trying to provide for your family, a senior in a nursing home, or a child who counts on school for your only hot meal, you're on your own. This isn't about balancing the books. It's about picking winners and letting everybody else fall behind. And who loses? It's the Americans working 2 jobs, raising kids, caring for elderly parents, and just trying to stay afloat. Because if you grew up in a family like mine, you also know how hard people work to reach their American dream. The promise that if you work hard, that your kids will get a good public education, you'll be able to put food on the table, and you'll be able to go to the doctor and stay healthy, and your kids will be able to grow up and achieve their own American dream. This promise is already getting harder, and it's getting more expensive. We need to be working together across the aisle to ensure that everyone who works hard can have a brighter future. But that's not what my Republican colleagues are doing with this bill. The plan that they are jamming through right now will put the American dream out of reach for more families. And for what? To hand out more tax breaks to people with more wealth than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Now, Mr. President, I've spent the last several months traveling across Arizona. I've been to our big cities, Phoenix and Tucson. I've been to small towns like Clarkdale and Sierra Vista, talking to Arizonans face to face, listening to their stories, hearing what it would mean to them if Medicaid, food assistance, and other essential services got cut for them and their families. And what I've heard is clear. This budget is going to make it harder for them to stay afloat, let alone get ahead. In Clarksdale, I met a guy named Christian. He's a rural hospital nephrologist. That's a kidney doctor. And he told me that his patients, many of whom rely on Medicaid for dialysis, are now considering stopping treatment altogether because they might not be able to afford it. He said, this is a quote from Christian, he said, financially, none of the patients I serve can pay out of pocket. It's a choice of either massive debt or death. That's the reality to many rural communities. Another woman told me about her friend, a survivor of 2 car accidents and a spinal injury. Her friend relies on Medicaid to help her deal with her chronic pain. Without it, meaning Medicaid, she said that her friend might end her life because the pain is unbearable. She asked me to deliver this message to my colleagues. She said, this is not a country that can't afford to care for people like her. We can afford to care for everyone if we change our priorities from giving tax cuts to billionaires to taking care of Americans who are in pain every day. Mr. President, people across Arizona are pleading with us to get our priorities right. In Sierra Vista, I hosted a Medicaid town hall, and that's where I met this woman named Tara. She told us how she was once a single mother and how programs like Medicaid and SNAP helped her raise her kid and build a stable life. Today, she works a good job. She doesn't rely on these programs anymore. But here's what she said. She said, I am deeply concerned about the proposed cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and related programs. I know firsthand that they don't just help families, they're often the only path to stability. Just last week, I was in Tucson, where I live, where Gabby and I live, helping distribute school lunches at a local high school. It's actually the high school that my wife went to. And I wanted to see firsthand what these summer meal programs mean for Arizona families. These programs are funded through the United States Department of Agriculture, and they rely on data from SNAP and Medicaid to identify the children who need them the most. If this bill passes, a bunch of these kids that I served, I think it was last weekend, they won't be eligible for these programs anymore. It will be harder for them to access school meals, which I think we all know it compromises their academic performance. That's the real cost of this legislation. It's not numbers on a spreadsheet. It's hunger. It's illness. It's fear. It's a bunch of folks who work really hard, doing everything right, and they're still going to get punched in the gut. And it's not just what I hear in person, Mr. President. My office gets hundreds of letters and phone calls every week from Arizonans. People are scared, and they want us to listen. I want to share some of their voices. Frank is a veteran on dialysis. He called this week, and he said, the food bank and my SNAP benefits are the only way I eat right now. I can't work. I'm not old enough to retire, and I'm dipping into my retirement early just to keep up with my mortgage. Without this help, I don't know what I will do. Mr. President, veterans should never have to say those words in this country. One of the most sacred promises we make to the men and women who serve is that we will take care of them when they return home. That promise doesn't end when they hang up the uniform. It includes making sure that they can afford food, access health care, and live with some dignity. And yet, here's Frank, sick, struggling, and wondering how he'll survive because the programs he relies on are under threat. Cheryl from Tucson, who is a 59-year-old widow, said, I receive disabled widows' benefits, Medicaid, Medicare, and SNAP. Get this. She said, my rent and utilities eat all but about $300 of my monthly income. SNAP and my health care card used to cover most of my food costs. I used to have about $40 left over to buy some extra groceries for the unsheltered in my area. So here's a woman with $40 extra, and she's helping other people. She also says, now, buying food for my household takes all of it. I'm scared. If I lose even one of these benefits, I'll lose the grip that keeps the roof over my head. Karen from Scottsdale has worked for over 25 years helping veterans and people with disabilities. She wrote, many of the people I work with rely on Medicaid because they can only work part-time or because their employers don't offer benefits. Cutting them off will just make health care more expensive for everyone. The rich do not need an extension on tax cuts at the expense of low-income and middle-class families. Mr. President, these are my constituents. These are folks who, unprompted, took time to write or call their senator. And every single one of them, Mr. President, is saying the same thing. We're barely holding on, and we're scared this is going to put us over the edge. Now, I wish I could say that these stories were met with compassion by everybody here. But instead, one of my Republican colleagues apparently said, this is a quote, "They'll get over it." And another, when asked whether cutting Medicaid would cost lives, said, "Well, we're all going to die anyway." Now, I didn't come here to throw jabs. I'm repeating those words because they reveal how this budget was written without any connection to the real-world consequences. This isn't about politics. It's about people. So I ask again, what are we doing here? Who do we serve? Is it people like Tara and Cheryl and Crystal and Frank who are working hard and doing everything right to just try to get by? Or is it a bunch of billionaires who've already made it and who don't need another handout? If my colleagues don't believe me, I urge them to go read some of the emails and listen to some of the phone calls that they're getting. Maybe hold a town hall. Listen to those folks. Really, listen to what they are saying. Don't crush their American dream. Don't rig the system even more against them. Don't take a vote just because it's easy. We can do better for the people we serve. Mr. President, they deserve that from us. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Wisconsin.
I rise today in disbelief. You know, it may sound a little cheesy, but at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe in public service. I believe it can be a force for good, a force that gives people opportunity, a force that is people-powered, that can lift our neighbors up and instill hope, a force that meets the toughest challenges of our constituents, and that is why I am struck with disbelief. Disbelief because if you believe these things like I do, which I would argue most of my colleagues here do, why would you be jamming this bill through? At a time when Wisconsin families are asking us to take on the high cost of living and let them have a fair shot at success, Republicans are raising costs and making an already unfair tax system even worse. My Republican colleagues are not using their time and energy to go after greedy corporations, not to lower the cost of housing, and not to expand access to affordable health care, but rather they are instead forging ahead with a bill that will kick millions of Americans off their health insurance, jack up prices for care for millions more, and literally take food off the tables of hungry families. Look, I was on the same ballot as Donald Trump last year. I heard the same concerns from my constituents that he did. Families needed some breathing room. My Republican colleagues often say that this president's victory gave him a mandate. Well, then, the president and I got the same mandate: to lower costs and give people the opportunity to live a steady and comfortable life. But in response, the difference could not be more stark. I'm actually working to do something about it. And this bill, the landmark bill from this president and the Republican Party, does just the opposite and will raise costs for families. One of the biggest cost drivers I hear about is health care. And so instead of standing up to big drug companies to lower prescription drug costs, and instead of building on the Affordable Care Act to expand access to health care coverage, this bill actually terminates coverage for Americans. In fact, 17 million Americans will be kicked off either Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act because of this bill. That is like stripping health care coverage from the entire populations of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa combined. And these aren't just numbers. These are people. These are people who have stories, and they matter. I should know, after battling a childhood illness, I became one of those Americans labeled as having a pre-existing health condition. And insurance companies were legally able to deny me coverage. But because of the Affordable Care Act, we changed that. And we gave families like mine hope. Hope that they can get health care at a price they can afford and sleep well at night knowing they have coverage. Medicaid has given that same hope for generations to some of our most vulnerable neighbors. But with this bill, my Republican colleagues are instilling fear. When we talk about Medicaid, we're talking about the elderly, people with disabilities, and children. We're talking about a single mother of 3 who is struggling to make ends meet, and so many more. I have traveled the state of Wisconsin from Superior to Racine, La Crosse to Green Bay, and everywhere in between, to hear from people who will be harmed by this bill. I have come to this very floor to share their stories, to try to help my Republican colleagues understand what this bill will mean. But it's not just the folks who need Medicaid to survive who are sounding the alarm. Take it from Dr. Abigail Wilgruber, a family medical resident in rural Wisconsin. She said this bill, quote, will deprive millions of Americans, particularly children, seniors, and individuals with disabilities, of the care they need to survive. She continued saying, these provisions will limit my ability to complete my job to the fullest, will lead to worse outcomes for patients. Or take it from Rosalanja Burbot, the executive director of an outpatient counseling center in the Fox Valley in Wisconsin, who said, and I quote, without Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements or with reduced rates, our nonprofit will struggle to survive. She continued to say, quote, I would hate to consider cutting staff or programs, but that could become our only option. We would lose the ability to serve hundreds of clients, not because the need has diminished, but because we could no longer afford to provide care without reimbursement. I have more and more of these stories from doctors, nurses, and administrators on the ground who are spelling out the absolutely dire consequences of this bill. In Wisconsin, we are already in a crisis when it comes to getting good health care in our rural communities. The system is broken, and this bill is destined to make it only worse. While health care is near and dear to my heart, there is more bad news in this bill. Republicans' big betrayal will also take food assistance, the literal means by which some people are able to put nutritious food on the table, away from them. This bill will take SNAP assistance, our nation's best way to make sure that no one goes hungry, away from more than 3 million Americans. And that leads us to the why. Republicans are making all of these cuts so that they can rig our tax code, which I must say already is deeply unfair to working families. And they would further tilt it in favor of the biggest corporations and the richest in our country. The Republican bill gives people at the top 0.1%, the richest of the rich, a tax cut of more than $250,000 every year. Yes, $250,000 a year. All the while, this bill hits working families the hardest. When taking into account the disastrous Medicaid and SNAP cuts, many working families would see their annual incomes fall by over $1,500. And it doesn't have to be this way. Yes, our system for taxes and health care are broken, but this bill is not the solution. This bill would make it harder for working families to have the opportunity to get ahead, harder for parents to get their kids health care, harder for families to put food on the table. We, Democrats and Republicans, should be working together to give some relief to workers, but instead, Republicans will choose to go it alone and vote to give the biggest corporations and the wealthy another unfair leg up. I will end with this. While I remain in disbelief and frankly disgust, I will always have hope. I have hope because it's not the people in this chamber with the power, it's the people. It's the people who will sadly feel the repercussions of this bill. It's the people who are rising up and will hold anyone who passes this disastrous bill accountable. That is where the true power is. And with that, I yield.
Madam President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, Democrats have been on the floor for hours today, pointing out what's in this 1,000-page bill that took over 16 hours to read. I call it the 1,000 pages of pain, the billionaires' gain. So it's bad enough that my colleagues have been on the floor talking about how this bill is going to hurt people on Medicaid, taking food away from our children and families through major cuts to the SNAP program, health care, food, housing, energy support, you name it. The pain is in this bill. But one of the areas that people don't know about is this bill actually has provisions that would take away support for our public schools. Okay, let that sink in. It's not enough that this bill has 1,000 pages of pain in just about every aspect of our lives that you can think of, but now they're coming after support for our public schools. So today, I am rising as an advocate for the 49 million children who are enrolled in public schools across our country. Nearly 90% of K-12 students go to public schools, including 95% of children with disabilities. Yet, we have a regime that is actively working to end federal support for public schools. We have a president who tried to totally eliminate the Department of Education, and sadly for him, he can't do it with through executive order because only Congress can do that, but they're doing a lot of other things that withhold support for public schools. So as Republicans in Congress are trying to undermine support for public schools through the first ever national private school voucher program. Let that sink in. The first ever national private school voucher program. That is taking money away from public schools and basically turning it over to private schools through a voucher program. So let's be clear. The school voucher program, the provision, isn't about money for schools. It's about even more money for billionaires because they're the folks who are going to get the most out of this voucher for public schools program. Under this program, wealthy donors would receive large handouts for supporting school vouchers. So this is why Washington. The Washington Post in their headline, GOP voucher plan would divert billions, $4 billion a year in taxes in perpetuity to private schools. So specifically, the plan would provide a dollar-for-dollar tax credit. We're not talking about tax deductions. We're talking about a tax credit. This is money that comes right off your taxable amount. So what this bill would do is provide a tax credit of $5,000 or 10% of a taxpayer's adjusted gross income, whichever is greater. So a taxpayer making $10 million, we do have people who make $10 million a year, could contribute $1 million and receive a credit for that full amount. How do you like that? You can get $1 million off your tax bill by contributing to this private school voucher program. So rather than calling this plan what it is, and I tell you, the word scam comes to my mind. It's like scamming the public schools. Republicans are deceitfully trying to sell this plan as an expansion of school choice for families. Oh, isn't this voucher program great? More families can send their kids to private school. Here's the reality. Based on what we know about school voucher programs, they do not promote school choice. Let me give you two examples of why this argument does not hold water. For one thing, school vouchers do not cover the full cost of private school tuition. When was the last time anybody thought about how much private schools cost? Maybe, in schools in Hawaii, private schools can cost something in the order of $15,000 to $20,000 a year, starting from kindergarten. A voucher program will not support that full amount. That means that families who want to send their kids to these private schools will have to make up the cost difference. Well, how many middle-income, low-income families would be able to exercise that choice to send their child to a private school that costs that much? And not only that, as we have seen in states that have passed voucher programs, private schools often raise their tuition when they become eligible for vouchers. Iowa is an example. After they approved vouchers in 2022, private schools there increased their prices by over 20% for kindergarten and by over 10% for other grade levels. Here's another example of why this argument that this program promotes choice. There are fewer private schools in rural communities, so many families do not have access to private schools if they live in rural communities. How does this expand choice for these families? The reality is the majority of vouchers have gone to wealthy families and to subsidizing school tuition for students who already attend private schools. Under this bill, Republicans will make that even worse by prioritizing scholarships for these students. I'm going to repeat that because not only is it bad enough that we're going to divert all of this money basically to private schools, but this bill actually has a provision that says the people who will get these scholarships are students who already go to private schools. In Louisiana, for example, now 99% of voucher tax credits there went to families with annual incomes above $200,000. In Virginia, the number was 87% of vouchers in that state going to wealthy families. In Arizona, it was 60%. Americans have consistently rejected school voucher programs and initiatives. Nebraska, Kentucky, and Colorado have all voted against voucher programs within the last year. In Nebraska, school vouchers were put on the ballot last November, and they were soundly defeated for the 4th time. This is not a Democratic or a Republican issue. Nebraska is not a red state. They voted for a Republican president by a 20-point margin, and yet they rejected school vouchers with 57% of the vote. The bottom line is, vouchers take money away from public schools, and Americans of all political stripes understand that. According to All for Ed, over 2/3 of voters would rather increase funding for public schools than increase funding for voucher programs. That is not a new sentiment. In all 17 state referendums on school vouchers since 1967, voters have rejected these programs. While the Republicans in this chamber may not give a rip about public schools, the vast majority of Americans get it. Democrats, Republicans, independents alike support strengthening our public schools, not taking money away from our public schools, because they know that strong public education is fundamental to a strong country. Well, undeterred by public sentiment, Republicans are trying to create, as I mentioned, a nationwide school voucher program. It's not enough that some states have voucher programs, but now the Republicans, through this misguided almost 1,000 pages of pain bill, they want to provide $4 billion per year for a private school voucher program with no accountability. Remember early on I said that a huge percentage of children with disabilities go to public schools? Well, private schools do not have any responsibility to make sure that they are providing education for children with disabilities. So no accountability. Let's just provide $4 billion per year, perpetuity, tax credit for private school programs that have no accountability along these lines. We all know that this kind of funding could be used for rural and low-income schools, for students with disabilities, for other programs that actually support and strengthen public schools. Instead, under the Republicans' plan, that funding will go to wealthy donors who will receive large handouts, up to $4 billion a year, for supporting school vouchers. Again, this plan will enable a taxpayer making $10 million a year to contribute $1 million and receive a dollar-for-dollar credit for that full amount. And even worse, the taxpayer could contribute appreciated stock and avoid capital gains on the appreciation. And there's all kinds of data on who owns stocks in this country, and generally it's the people with a lot of wealth. So this bill had a provision that enabled people to donate appreciated stock so that they could escape capital gains taxes on that stock contribution totally. So this Republican voucher proposal, outlandish as it is, was briefly delayed after it was deemed non-compliant with budget rules earlier this week. Republicans remained undeterred, and they have decided to plow forward with a nearly identical plan. What it comes down to is this plan does not help students. It does not promote choice. It does not support public schools where the majority of our kids go. We should be supporting our public schools, not taking resources away from them. So my Democratic colleagues and I will continue to fight to fund quality public schools to improve public education in this country. Foundational. This voucher plan is yet another wrong-headed proposal that should be called out for what it is, a handout for the wealthy at the expense of hardworking American families. I urge my colleagues to reject this idea, and I yield back.
Madam President.
The senator from Georgia.
Madam President, I rise tonight in a moral moment in our nation. As we debate this bill, so much is on the line. The health care of over 16 million Americans, 750,000 of them Georgians, is on the line. Food for hungry children. In a wealthy nation where 1 in 5 children are already food insecure. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Their livelihood, their welfare is on the line. The well-being of seniors in nursing homes and the disabled who rely on Medicaid and those who care for them is on the line. The fate of rural hospitals in Georgia, in Alaska, in Louisiana, in little towns all over this nation that are right now barely hanging on is on the line, and the scraps that they are throwing them while cutting them will not save them. And my friends on the other side of the aisle know it. They know that these scraps that they're throwing at rural hospitals will not save them. And so in a very real sense, lives are on the line. We are in a moral moment because something else is on the line. I submit that the character of the country is on the line. In a real sense, the question tonight is, who are we? Not who do we tell ourselves we are, but who are we really? What and who do we care about? What kind of nation are we? And what kind of people do we want to be? Who matters? And who doesn't? Who do we think is dispensable? In no place is the answer to that question clearer than in a nation's budget. I submit that a budget is not just a fiscal document. A budget is a moral document. Show me your budget and I'll show you who you think matters and who doesn't. And if this awful budget were an EKG, it would suggest that our nation has a heart problem and is in need of moral surgery. And so I'm clear tonight. I understand the nature of what we are engaged in. This is a political process. It is. But it is also a moral exercise. Not only for the nation, but for each of us individually. And especially for the mere 100 of us out of a nation of 300 million who get to vote, perhaps in a matter of hours. We have the rare privilege of standing up for people who have entrusted with us the covenant of centering their families. It's a real privilege for the people of your state to say that since we can't all go to Washington, we're going to trust you in rooms of power to be thinking about our children, to be thinking about our parents as they deal with the blessings and the burdens of growing old. And so the question for me tonight is, how will we show up in this moment? And that's why yesterday I gathered in the Russell Rotunda with a multi-faith coalition of clergy to pray that lawmakers might have the courage to stand up to their party, to stand up to the special interests, and protect seniors in nursing homes and pregnant mothers on Medicaid and children who risk going to school hungry every single day in this country. 1 in 5 children in the wealthiest nation on the planet already food insecure. And with these SNAP cuts, this body is about to make it worse. And so, surrounded by a clergy of many faith traditions, yesterday I prayed that we would have the courage. I prayed that we would have the grace to stand as voices for the voiceless. And as I stood there, I could not help but feel a sense of deja vu. This is not the first time I've been in our nation's capital speaking out against these policies that betray hardworking families. It was 8 years ago, almost to the day in 2017, when Washington Republicans were trying to pass a tax bill that favored wealthy Americans over working families, that I came to this building not as a senator, but as a pastor. I had no idea that 8 years later I would be serving in this body. I had no notion that I would even run for the Senate. I came as a citizen. And standing with a multi-faith coalition, we were praying for our nation's leaders. We were gathered in the rotunda of the Russell building, and as we were singing and praying, the Capitol Police said, I'm sorry, pastors, you can't sing and pray in the rotunda. If you do not disperse, we will have to arrest you. And let me say that the Capitol Police did not mishandle us that day. They were first-rate professionals. But they said that if you don't disperse, we will have to arrest you. What they didn't understand is that I had already been arrested. My conscience had been arrested. My heart and my imagination, my moral imagination, had been arrested by this idea that we as a country are better than this. I come from a tradition where you don't just pray with your lips, you pray with your legs. You put your body in the struggle for other struggling bodies. And so here I am tonight, 8 years later, having transformed my agitation into legislation. I was arrested that day, but I have transformed my protests into public policy. 8 years ago, I was on the outside. Tonight, I'm on the inside, but it's the same fight. Some of us fight on the inside, some of us fight on the outside. Some of us get to serve in the Senate or in the House. Others are just watching at home tonight. But be really clear that we are in the same fight, whether we are on the streets or in the suites. Same fight. And in some ways, this is the same bill 8 years later, just worse. Like most horror movies, the sequel tends to be worse. We were here 8 years ago. Washington politicians were trying their best to gut the Affordable Care Act. Remember that? They were trying to gut the Obamacare out of political motives. Millions of Americans were spared. But tonight is the sequel to that horror movie. They are back to their old political tricks, trying to dismantle the ACA again with this legislation. It's the same fight, just worse this time. Instead of extending tax credits that would lower health insurance costs for the middle class, my friends on the other side are giving billionaires and the richest of the rich a tax cut. They are working real hard tonight to help billionaires because God knows they are having a hard time, apparently. And what that means is that 1.2 million Georgians and nearly 20 million Americans are going to see their health care premiums rise. That's what's at stake tonight. If they enact these deep cuts to Medicaid, as they are positioned not to extend these premiums, these tax credits, they are raising the cost of health care for all of us. Even if you are on private insurance, you are not safe. Your health care is about to go up. Your hospital might close because they're cutting these clean energy tax cuts. Your utility bills are about to go up. And so I have a question tonight. Who voted for that? Some of us are Democrats, some of us are Republicans, some of us are independents, some voted for one party, some voted for the other party. I get it, but who voted for that? Who voted for everybody's health care premiums to go up and their hospitals to close? Here's what I know. The folks back in Georgia didn't vote for that. They voted for me and they voted for Donald Trump, but they didn't vote for that. Ordinary folks don't want this. Just ordinary, everyday people who barely pay attention to politics, they don't want this. Even a Fox News poll, and you won't often hear me say that, but even a Fox News poll from this month found that Americans don't support this big, ugly bill. This is symptomatic of the ways in which the people's voices have been squeezed out of their democracy. This is not just a health care fight, it is that. It is not just a fight for food security, for SNAP, it is that. But in a real sense, it is a fight for our democracy, whose voice gets to be heard in this chamber. That's what this is about, the character of the country. Ordinary Americans don't want to do this to our children. That's why they need to know that 71% of all Medicaid enrollees in Georgia are children. 71%. Taking away health care from kids to pay for tax cuts for billionaires. Now, let me be clear. I'm all for tax cuts. I believe working families deserve a tax cut, and I certainly don't want to see them face a tax hike this year. That's why I want to nearly double the child tax credit. I believe in tax cuts for hardworking families, for middle-class people, for working-class families. But instead of doing that, instead of helping working-class families who are struggling now against a 10% tax on everything and rising costs, we're now burdening our children by adding $3 trillion to the debt. We're taking away health care from kids and then burdening them with the debt. We are engaged in Robin Hood in reverse, this body of stealing from the poor in order to give to the rich. This massive transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. Yeah, this is socialism for the rich. And when the people hear about it, guess what? They don't like it. Democrats and Republicans and independents, when the people hear about what's in this big, ugly bill, they don't like it. And that's why the folks on the other side are trying their best to fast track it. That's why they're trying to pass it, and they haven't even finished writing it. They're twisting themselves in knots, making their members walk the plank under the threat of a primary to pass this big, ugly bill. The American people do not want to rob our children of food and health care and then burden them with trillions in debt to give billionaires and wealthy corporations another tax cut. The people do not want this bill. And so if the people do not want this bill, but they are trying to pass it, here's the question you got to ask yourselves at home. You have to ask yourselves, well, who are they working for? Who are they fighting for? Who do they think matters? Do you think they are working for you? This is a moral moment, and a budget is a moral document. And we have been summoned to this moment, people of faith and people of moral courage who claim no particular faith at all. And maybe because I was here yesterday and 8 years ago for a similar fight with faith leaders, maybe because I'm a preacher and it's Sunday, and I've been here instead of church, I have especially been thinking about those of us who are people of faith. People whose lives are informed by Scripture, people of the book. And maybe those of us who have different politics but read from the same book ought to spend some time together reading the book. Because I do sometimes wonder, and I say this with all humility, none of us owns the truth. But if I'm honest, there are days when I have to ask people of my faith tradition as a Christian, are we reading the same book? The book I know says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was sick, I was in prison, and you visited me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it also unto me. The book that I love says, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. My book says, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full. The prophet Amos condemns those who buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They sell the poor out and working class people for cheap. And for those of us who have a vote in this moment, for my colleagues who are swinging on a moral dilemma, I hear the prophet Micah say, he has already told you what is good. And what does the Lord require? But that you do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. May God be with our nation and grant us grace, wisdom, and courage for this moment. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, first I want to thank my colleagues, and especially just now my colleague from Georgia, for their work tonight, for their expression of what's at stake in this moment, and to Senator Warnock, I say thank you and amen. I'm here today because I'm joining the majority of Americans who are deeply alarmed by this plan from the President and his congressional allies, a plan that will make life less affordable for more Americans. When we return home for this 4th of July, it'd be nice to be able to tell our constituents that we came together and passed bipartisan legislation to help bring down costs for families. Instead, my colleagues who vote for this legislation will have to explain why, at a time when families' pocketbooks are strained, they chose to support a partisan bill to make American life even less affordable. What will America look like once this bill takes effect? Millions of people will have lost their health coverage thanks to the largest cut to Medicaid in American history. More people won't be able to afford preventive care and cancer screenings, and more people will get sick. Healthcare premiums will surge for everyone because fewer people will have care and the number of uninsured Americans will increase. Rural hospitals will close their doors because they lost Medicaid reimbursements that help keep them afloat. More people, especially in states like mine, will have to make long car rides just to get to a hospital 50 miles away in those desperate moments when minutes feel like hours and hours like eternities. Seniors will be thrown into grave peril because this bill threatens hundreds of billions in Medicare cuts. And once this plan eviscerates food assistance programs, it will be much harder for families to afford to put food on the table at a time when groceries are already far too expensive. Let there be no mistake. More families and children who today are being fed will go hungry. And all the while, our children will be burdened with trillions more in debt. In the name of what cause is all this done? Well, it's all to pay for tax breaks for billionaires. This bill will also make us an America where our people are less free. In New Hampshire, during my time as governor, we adopted Medicaid expansion with support from both political parties, and we balanced the budget at the same time. We understood that with health comes freedom, the freedom to work and provide for one's family, the freedom from disease and despair, the freedom that comes from, why do I even have to say this, being alive. Granite Staters also understood that a great country like ours treats its people with great dignity.
In America, we don't sacrifice the health of our neighbors, we don't let families fall sick, and we do not imperil our economy, our debt, and our workforce just to pay for a tax giveaway for a billionaire. So what kind of country will we be with this bill? We will not only be less healthy, but we will be less prosperous and less free. In short, this bill is at odds with what we aspire to be as Americans. It's also worth noting how remarkably out of step this bill is with the American people's plea to bring down costs. In a democracy like ours, theoretically, the people's representatives pass legislation that reflects the aspirations of the majority. I say theoretically because clearly that is not what is happening today. Indeed, according to the data from the Joint Economic Committee minority, if one combines this bill with the president's tariffs, firefighters, truck drivers, and teachers, for instance, will lose $470 or more next year, while the top 0.1%, that's people who earn about $4 million or more, will be $348,000 richer. This bill would take away health care from tens of thousands of Granite Staters and would take a similar toll across the country. Indeed, in both Florida and Texas, the number of people who will lose their health insurance is greater than the entire population of New Hampshire. Millions of people losing care with a stroke of a pen. What have these people done to deserve that? All the American people are asking for is for us to help bring down costs. So the president and the Republicans in Congress take away their health care? Sometimes in Washington, we're faced with bills that fail to fully meet the moment, to be sure. But it is rare to find legislation like this, a bill that makes life less affordable during a time when Americans of every political stripe are crying out for lower costs. A bill that seems as if it was drafted just to make a mockery of the wills and wishes of the majority of people in this country. Lately, many of my colleagues and some political pundits have been talking about this bill as if it were inevitable, a runaway freight train so vast that it cannot be stopped. And in light of this inevitability, they suggest that some of the bill's deficiencies can just be overlooked. But of course, this bill was not inevitable, nor is it now. So let's be clear. Each and every senator in this body has free will, God-given free will, which means that the measures in this legislation that gut Medicaid weren't written by mistake or by chance. We didn't arrive at this day with a vote on this terrible budget bill by accident. Let's not delude ourselves. We're only here because a majority in this body decided to ignore the majority of the country and made a series of decisions. The Republican majority decided to gut Medicaid. They decided to take away health care from millions. They decided to raise insurance premiums for the rest of us. They decided that closed hospitals were a risk worth taking. They decided that taking food away from hungry kids was acceptable. They decided that trillions more in debt was not a problem. The Republican majority decided that depriving the American people of all these things and raising their costs were worth it, just as long as they paid for another tax break for billionaires. Because that's the bargain that this administration, along with my Republican colleagues, is forcing the American people to accept. Our people will be less healthy, our kids will have more debt, but the president and billionaires like him will get a tax break. Of course, part of what makes this bill so frustrating is that it includes some individual provisions that I've spent years trying to pass into law. This bill includes provisions I support, some even that I authored, like strengthening the R&D tax deduction to support our entrepreneurs and a tax cut for families to make child care more affordable. I also support this bill's provisions which would tackle our housing crisis by expanding the low-income housing tax credit to bring down the cost of housing, as well as a provision making mortgage insurance tax deductible so that it's easier to buy a home. And I'd support a bill with real tax cuts for the middle class and small businesses, unlike the token measures included in this bill. If my Republican colleagues worked across the aisle to draft a bill that brought this bipartisan approach to other critical areas, like health care and food assistance, I'd vote for it. Instead, my colleagues chose to take these common sense solutions hostage by linking every good idea to 3 bad ones, turning this into a purely partisan endeavor. So yes, I'm glad that some of these bipartisan provisions will be signed into law, but I regret that they aren't a part of a truly bipartisan effort because of the politics of division and destruction that President Trump brings to Washington. Now, I know that there are many areas of common ground with my Republican colleagues in this body, but it has become far too difficult to move forward on finding solutions when at every turn the president seems far more interested in demonizing and dividing rather than bringing people together, turning areas of agreement into weapons to force disagreement. Now, that's exactly the kind of cynical politics of division that does lasting damage to our families, our economy, and our democracy. Now, President Trump likely will get this bill passed. He may get enough of the Republican caucus to stand in line once again to pass it, even though my Republican colleagues know that budget analysts have added up the financial cost of this bill and have told them that it adds trillions upon trillions to our national debt, burdening our children's future. But you know, as important as the debt is, it's not the only cost of passing this awful bill. There's another kind of cost, a cost not simply of dollars and cents. I shouldn't have to remind this administration and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the nature of this cost. They know it. But just to be clear, this tax break for corporate special interests and billionaires has a price that can't be summed up in a budget line or written off during tax season. Because when we debate health care in America, some dress up these discussions with words like reconciliation and program and discretionary spending. But what they're talking about is being sick and being healthy. What they're talking about, whether they want to admit it or not, is living and dying. So how much does this bill cost? The cost is millions of Americans losing their health care. The cost is countless families feeling the pain of higher insurance premiums. The cost is a mother being forced to choose between paying out of pocket for her own care or paying for groceries for her kids. It's a price that's exacted in cancers that go undetected. It's exacted in chronic illnesses that go untreated. It's exacted in the healthcare challenges in our country that continue to go unaddressed because we spend all our energies simply trying to keep our heads above water in floods of the president's own making. The price tag is more than dollars and cents. It includes the cost of losing more people from our workforce because they're too ill to work. It includes the gnawing pains of hunger and the slow toll of malnutrition that will come as food assistance programs are robbed. It includes the anguish of young parents no longer knowing how they will make ends meet. It includes the lost hopes and deferred dreams of people held back by illness. It includes the cost of having to say more early goodbyes. What is the price tag of this bill? The price, in the end, is the health and freedom of millions of Americans, a price that will be paid because somewhere on the road that brought us here in President Trump's Washington, some people decided that the health of some child or her mother may be dear, but it doesn't carry the same weight as a bigger tax return for a billionaire does. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam President. And the hour is late. I want to thank the presiding officer for being here. I'm glad to be here with my colleagues from New Hampshire and my neighbor from New Mexico. I want to thank the floor staff that's here tonight. And I would like to suggest, this is not the purpose of my speech, but the next time that senators make the suggestion that the floor staff should spend the entire night reading a bill here, that the senators actually read that bill instead of imposing that on the staff that's here. I think that would be a just thing for us to do and the appropriate and proper thing for us to do. Madam President, the last time that we were headed down this road, when Republicans were passing President Trump's 2017 deficit exploding tax cut, it didn't take a mathematical genius to figure out what was about to happen. I told the Senate at that time, as our debt grows, we will spend billions more, not on schools, roads, and innovation, but on interest costs. Worse, we're about to blow another hole in the debt without really helping the middle class. 8 years ago, I said, on top of that, we know that when deficits swell, as they surely will, cuts to Medicaid and Medicare are sure to follow, further burdening working families struggling to make ends meet. Well, here we are. That's exactly the story of this bill. Utterly predictable. This bill, which massively increases our deficit when our children can least afford it. The Republican senators passing this bill tonight or tomorrow morning, if they do, know they're doing it when we have already hit a new milestone for the first time in American history. Our interest payments, Madam President, exceed the amount that we spend on our national defense. For the first time, the American people, because of the irresponsibility in this chamber, are going to pay $1 trillion in interest. That is a massive number. That is essentially the same as what we spend on Medicare, what we spend on children and higher education together, what we spend on housing, bridges, broadband, ports, and highways combined. I want to be very clear tonight that over the years, Democrats and Republicans have pursued policies that have led to that $1 trillion in interest payments. There is no doubt about it. And it's worth thinking about what we could do if we hadn't made such fiscally irresponsible choices. Expand the child tax credit, as my colleague from Georgia said, and cut childhood poverty in half and hunger by a quarter. Build a modern energy grid to meet our expanding energy demands so Americans in cities and rural communities can enjoy affordable, reliable energy at home. Establish a healthcare system that the American people deserve, a modern system that people in other rich industrialized countries take for granted, a system that does not cost twice as much with worse outcomes, like in the United States of America, the richest country in the world, that forces parents to choose between their children's prescriptions and school supplies, that exhausts the American people who day after day after day have to fight endless negotiations with their insurance companies just to keep their children covered, that constantly threatens rural hospitals and clinics with closure in this country. No other rich country in the world puts up with that craziness. And we're spending twice as much as any other country in the world to get worse health care, worse outcomes, more scarcity. Every senator on this floor might make a different choice about the policies that they would enact, their preferred policies. But I doubt, Madam President, there is anybody here who is willing to go home and defend the virtues of wasting $1 trillion of the American people's money on interest payments. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and outside groups like the Penn Wharton Budget Lab tell us that by the end of the next 10 years, we will have the highest debt ratio ever, eclipsing the debt our nation had in the 1940s. What was happening in the 1940s? That's when the greatest generation had borrowed money to defeat economic misery at home through the New Deal and European fascism by becoming the arsenal of democracy. Those were their receipts. Those were the receipts of a generation that understood its commitment to the next generation, to us. When we contemplate from this broken Senate the patriotic accomplishments of the greatest generation, what has always seemed particularly egregious to me have been the tax policy Republicans have passed 4 times since Ronald Reagan passed it in 1981. Every single time they made the same promises. Every time. Look it up. They made the same promises that their trickle-down tax policy would drive economic growth, cut our deficit, pay for themselves. Every time, including the recent Trump tax cut in 2017, these promises have been false. They've been false. That was 8 years ago. That wasn't a century ago. We know what the math is. Everybody in this room knows the deficit is far worse today than it was when Donald Trump passed those tax cuts. President Trump has had a very rare thing happen, which is he got to take 4 years off and come back and be president. The effect of the tax cuts he passed the last time that he said we're going to pay for themselves clearly have not. There's nobody in this chamber who can deny that. I always find it amazing when I hear these promises, why people make them if they know they're so false, over and over and over again. And I think the reason is, Madam President, that it is a way that politicians in Washington can avoid the objections that you could never get away with at home. Imagine for a minute if there were a mayor in America, any mayor, in any town, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, or in Lyman, Colorado, or in Los Angeles, California. It doesn't matter, Republican town or a Democratic town. Imagine if a mayor came to you, Madam President, and said, this town is going to borrow more money than we have ever borrowed before. That would worry you, that would worry me. And I think our first question would be to that mayor, okay, that worries me. What are you going to spend the money on that you're borrowing? Are you going to spend it on schools? No. Are you going to spend it on parks? No. Are you going to spend it on the water infrastructure that so many communities in New Mexico require? Are you going to spend it on the mental health crisis that our teenagers are facing? because of our failure to address it. Are you going to spend it on infrastructure? And the answer to all those questions would be no. What are you going to spend the money on, Mr. Mayor? Well, the answer is I am going to give tax cuts to the 2 richest neighborhoods in town and hope that those trickle down to everybody else. That is the Republican tax policy. There's a reason why no mayor in America has ever done that. There is no mayor in America who has ever pursued trickle-down economics, because you would get run out on a rail. You would get run out on a rail if you went and said, we are going to borrow the most money that has ever been borrowed from our children to finance tax cuts for the richest neighborhoods in town. It makes no sense. It is preposterous. And yet that has been the argument since Ronald Reagan first said these tax cuts will be paid for. The economy will grow. There won't be a deficit. There's a reason we're paying more than $1 trillion in interest today, and that's because our deficits are enormous. Fortunately, and this is really important for the American people to understand, we still live in the strongest country in the world. We are in the world's richest economy. We have the most lethal military. Apart from our president, we have a national commitment to an independent judiciary, the rule of law, and low levels of corruption in our economy and in our society. We have unparalleled capital markets, cutting-edge innovation, and world-leading universities. We have all those things going for us, partly because the folks that came before us invested in those things and built those things and tended those things. But what we struggle with in our time is a sense among most Americans that they can't get ahead, that the American dream is farther and farther out of reach for themselves and for their family. And in my view, that is the biggest challenge our country faces. And in the face of this bill's ill-considered tax cuts to our health care, and in the face of this bill's ill-considered tax cut and cuts to our health care system, which is going to throw millions of people off their health care and make health care more expensive for everybody else. By the way, what's the logic of that? The logic of that is that when you throw people off their health care, they end up going to the emergency room to take care of themselves and take care of their families, just as anybody would. That's the most expensive care that anybody could have. That expense is then put into our insurance, in our insurance policies, and all of us are going to pay more. You can't wish away people just because you throw them off health insurance. When other countries in the world, other wealthy, rich countries in the world have a system of insurance that basically guarantees health care and mental health care to their citizens, it's worth asking why we would throw our people off the not-so-great health insurance that they have. That's a good question. But it's particularly crazy when it just drives up the cost for everybody else. We need to deeply think about the challenges that our country is facing today. It's more unequal. The top 1% owns 30% of our nation's wealth, Madam President, and the bottom 50% owns 2.5%. The top 1% of Americans own 50% of the value of the stock market. The top 1% of Americans own 50% of the value of the stock market, while the bottom 50% owns just 1% of its value. Something that's really affecting my state is the nation's median home price is now 5 times higher than median family income. And as a result, the average first-time homebuyer is now 38 years old. Madam President, 38 years old versus 29 just a generation ago. Reading scores in our nation have hit a 20-year low. And perhaps most damning and perhaps most upsetting is that our lifespan has declined since the 1980s. We are now on average likely to die 6 years shorter than other people that live in wealthy countries around the world. If you're African American, your chance of dying is on average 12 years sooner than people living in the industrialized world. If we don't shift course soon, Madam President, we will be the first generation of Americans whose kids and grandkids will be worse off than we are. That has never happened before. We are on track for that to happen to our children. Many young people today can't afford to live on their own, and they may never be able to afford a house. They can't afford health care or child care. They can't count on a quality education for their children in too many parts of America. Some are really worried about whether they're going to be able to afford a child at all. If you haven't heard a family say that to you in your town halls or in your meetings, you haven't been paying attention. But instead of addressing any of these challenges, we are debating a bill tonight that will make the wealthiest Americans even wealthier and the poorest Americans even poorer, 500,000 of whom live in Colorado, while adding millions more to the debt which working Americans are going to have to pay back. That's what this Republican trickle-down economics comes down to. No matter how you dress it up, that's what it comes down to. Our generation has made some very bad choices when it comes to our children's future. This bill only makes matters worse for them. And all this debt will constrain the choices that they are going to be able to make for themselves. And that's a shame, Madam President. Because unlike us, perhaps they will aspire to following in the footsteps of the greatest generation to build a country where lifespans are growing, not falling, where economic mobility is rising, where poverty and economic anxiety are falling, where energy exports are increasing and emissions are decreasing, where quality health care and child care, education, and affordable housing are abundant, not scarce. It seems obvious to me, Madam President, that our child's ambition should be ours as well. Unfortunately, tomorrow, the Republican majority may pass a bill that takes us further in the wrong direction. In its wake and in its wreckage, Americans who do feel an obligation to the next generation are going to have to fight even harder to fulfill our duty. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from California.
Madam President, today we meet at the center of a great debate, at a crossroads that will determine the direction of the country for another generation. And this debate this choice goes to the heart of a central question that has been plaguing families in America over the last 3 decades, but that is now just coming to the forefront. And that question is this: if you are working hard in America, can you still earn a good living for yourself and your family? If you are working hard in America, can you still buy a home or pay your rent, buy your food and medicine, get the health care you need, afford fuel for your car, get a decent education, or go on a family vacation? And if the answer is no, and for all too many millions of people the answer is no, what do we do about it? When I was a kid, my father was in the clothing business. He was a traveling salesman and he made $18,000 a year. On the strength of that single income, my parents bought our first home for $18,000. He made $18,000 a year and he bought a home. My parents bought a home for $18,000. It was the American dream and it came true for our family. Today I'm a U.S. Senator. That too is part of the American dream, that anything is possible in this country. But could anyone buy a home for the cost of the annual income even of a U.S. Senator? Not a chance in the world. An average home in California costs 3 or 4 times that much. My kids are paying thousands and thousands of dollars a month in rent. Could they find a home for the cost of their annual income? There is even less of a chance of that. And what about your grandkids? At the rate we are going, at the rate housing prices are rising, what chance will they have to afford a home at any income? And of course, it's not just a home. Healthcare costs are rising even faster. Millions of families are only one healthcare crisis away from failing. And it's not their fault. It's not their fault. They are working hard, harder than ever, and they can't keep pace with rising premiums, out-of-pocket costs, hospital stays, drug costs, and charges at the emergency room. Energy prices are going up. It costs more to heat your home in the winter and a lot more to cool your home in the summer. Utility bills have been rising by double digits, while incomes have remained comparatively flat. It's too much. It's too much. Now, why is this coming to a head now? Why, when we're not in a Great Depression, not even a Great Recession, although with Trump's destructive tariff wars, we may get there soon enough, why now? Why now is this coming to a head? And the answer is that people feel more squeezed than ever, more pressure than ever, more like a failure than ever because they're doing their best, working their hardest, and they are still hanging by a thread. And you know something? It's not their fault. It's not their fault. They are doing everything they can to provide for their families, and it's just not enough. It's not their fault, but it is someone's fault. It is someone's responsibility. There is someone who should be held accountable for the fact that this generation is the first to renege on a compact between generations that we would leave the country better off to the next generation than the one that came before. And you know who that someone is? It is us. It is us. The world has changed, the nature of work has changed, and we have not changed with it. We have not kept pace, and in too many ways, through our policy failures, we have moved the country in the wrong direction. And the question before us today is whether we continue to barrel down that track towards higher home prices, bigger health care costs, more hunger and greater hardship, or whether we change direction. Much too late, yes, requiring an even more profound course correction, certainly, but finally steer this country to a better quality of life for all of our citizens. Is this bill that change in direction? Does it lead our country on a new path towards affordability and prosperity? And the answer, the simple, terrible, but clear as day answer is no, it most emphatically does not. No, it does nothing to bring down costs. No, it does nothing to make it easier for your kids or mine to buy a house, pay their rent, buy groceries, afford their medicine, or fill up the car for a family vacation. Instead, it throws more coal in the engine, barreling down a track to nowhere. Donald Trump promised he wouldn't cut Medicaid. But this bill cuts hundreds of billions of dollars from Medicaid. It is shredding the president's commitment made again and again. In January, the president said Republicans will love and cherish Medicaid. In February, he said, we're not going to touch it. Even a few weeks ago, the president said, we're not changing Medicaid, we're leaving it. But we see in the black and white in this text they released in the dark of night that simply isn't true. This bill will result in millions losing their health care from cuts to Medicaid. We know that. The Republicans know that. Tom Tillis has made this point over and over again tonight, as have other Republicans in this body. This bill will close down hospitals in the poorest counties and states. It will raise health care costs for families everywhere and by the thousands of dollars. It takes food away from the hungry. It kills clean energy so that we have to rely on oil and gas for everything, enriching that industry and impoverishing the rest of us with higher prices at the pump. It raises taxes on working families and the middle class while lowering taxes on the very wealthy and corporations. If you are in the top 0.1% of income earners making more than $5 million a year, you will get a $346,000 tax cut. How is that fair? How is that right? And it borrows the money from our kids to pay for that $346,000 tax cut, to pay for the habits of really rich people. Where is the fairness, the morality in that? When is enough enough? My father was part of the greatest generation. We, it would appear, are part of the most selfish. And I'm fed up with it. I'm fed up with it. What happened to any sense of responsibility in this generation? What happened to love of country? Can we love our country and impoverish it? Can we love our children and grandchildren if we take from them only to give to ourselves? In this bill, we borrowed trillions from our kids. And for what? So the rich can have a bigger boat? So corporate CEOs can have more money? So a company can buy back more of its stock? So we can be richer than our neighbor while his neighbor has no home at all? The test of our progress, Franklin Roosevelt said in 1937, is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. Last week, a landscaper in Los Angeles was tackled to the ground because he was undocumented. He's the father of 3 Marines. 3 Marines. When one of those Marines was finally able to speak to his father after his detention, he had one ask of his son: please go back to the work site and finish the job. That was his ask. That is the work ethic that has made this country great, not the ethic that brought him to the ground. Raising 3 Marines, that is the patriotism that has made this country great, not the rancor that beat him while he lay there. But if this bill is not the answer, and it most certainly is not, if this bill only makes matters worse, far worse, then what is the answer? What direction shall we go? How can we begin to make the country work for people once again? Well, we can give instead of take. We can build instead of tear down. We can recapture once again the sense of possibility in this country. If Eisenhower was part of the generation that won the war and built the roads and highways, let us be the generation that wins the peace by creating the next giant boom in housing in America, making the investment necessary, tapping into the great potential of the government and industry working together, breaking down each obstacle in the way, millions and millions of new homes that my children can afford and your children. Let us build new hospitals instead of closing them down, and in so doing, bring the cost of health care down with them. Let us train new doctors and nurses so it is not so expensive to visit them, and new home health care workers to take care of us even as we take care of them. Let us grow more food and feed more people at home and abroad and bring down the cost of our groceries. Let us thank our farm workers instead of chasing them through the fields to separate them from those they love. None of this is beyond our capacity. It may mean that we can't afford yet another tax break for the wealthy, or a giveaway to the oil industry, or a giveaway to any other industry and its corporate titans. It may call for some sacrifice on our part, but a fraction of what our parents and grandparents gave to this country. It means that we pay more attention to our kids and their needs and less our own, that we once again show concern and compassion for our neighbor, and remember that we were once strangers in a strange land, that we show humility about our own achievements and recognize that none of us got here on our own, that all of us can prosper without someone else being made to suffer. You know, the way it used to be, the way it could be once again. Madam President, I yield back.
Madam President.
The senator from New Mexico.
President, I've heard several of my colleagues speak tonight about what this bill means for Americans all across America. Now, each of us has a responsibility to ask whether this bill meets the needs of the people that we're honored to serve. Now, I grew up on a small farm, as many of you know, working the land, caring for animals, sometimes even cleaning barns. And I can tell you, this bill does not pass the smell test. For New Mexicans, hardworking people, this bill does not help our families get ahead. New Mexicans work hard. Folks are not looking for a handout. New Mexicans are the type of people who would give you the shirt off their back if you needed it. It's just who we are, and I'm proud of it. But sometimes people fall in hard times. And I'll remind you all that this could happen to any of us. We might need medical care. We might need help putting food on the table. Maybe support to care for a loved one, or just want enough security to know that a job will be there for us. Some claim that this bill will help Americans, which we know is not the truth. Because from where I stand, there is very little in this legislation that helps hardworking New Mexicans. Now, it's important that this debate is happening, because now New Mexicans and people all across America can clearly see what's in this bill and what's not. As has been said time and time again this evening, the vast majority of this legislation benefits the ultra-wealthy, the wealthiest 0.1%, getting over $250,000 back in their pocket. Can you believe this? How many people might not make that in a lifetime? An extra $250,000 in their pockets. That's what this bill's about. Now, meanwhile, it does not help farmers. It does not support teachers or children. Nothing for New Mexico seniors who rely on Medicaid and SNAP. and nothing for New Mexicans who served our country and deserve our care in return. New Mexicans are hardworking people who believe in the values of loving your neighbor, following what the Bible teaches us. Do unto others as you have them do unto you. This bill goes against everything New Mexicans stand for. It's not honest, it's not caring, and it's not fair. Now, I've heard my colleagues try to claim that this bill does not cut assistance. That's a lie. It's not true. This bill cuts more than $1 trillion from the supplemental.